Good morning, students, and welcome to Wednesday. All right, we are more than halfway through the week. We've got 2 more days of new work, and then we've got Friday to catch up again. So great job. You're doing fantastic. Keep it up. Joke of the day. With your work, sometimes we receive feedback or grades. So why did the fish receive bad grades? Because his work was all below sea level. Sea level, like S-E-A, sea level, but like C as in like the old A, B, C, D grading, below sea level. So it's not good, right? You should be getting, A's and B's, proficient, advanced. Go for that in everything you do. All right, here's what we're doing today. Hopefully by now you have picked out a new book and you are reading a fantasy, and you're doing a great job with that. If you need help, let me know. I will give you some recommendations and we'll get you rolling through there, right? So number 1, we should be reading every day because reading is important, okay? As you are reading, we were looking at some different literary terms. Yesterday, we talked about theme and symbolism. So check out the video from yesterday and be thinking about what is the theme in your book. So what is the author trying to tell you or show you? And then what are some things that could be symbols that could represent something or make you think of something else? Today, we're going to get into a few more terms. The first term we're going to look at today is archetype. Archetype can be a kind of hard term to understand, right? But basically you look at the end of it and it says type, and so we want to think like the typical thing. That's what archetype is getting at. So the definition of an archetype, there's a few different ones out there, but an easy one is it's the basic storytelling pattern, a perfect example of a group or type. So if you have a specific type of story, a love story, a tragedy, when you think about Shakespeare, right, he had comedies, histories, tragedies, those were kind of archetypes, okay? For example, in Native American literature, the coyote is an archetype. It's the typical, the symbol, the representative of a trickster. So archetype is kind of like symbolism, but these are things that transcend, meaning they go across multiple stories or multiple genres. A symbol could be specific to each individual story, whereas the archetype would be like, oh yeah, that's the archetype of this that shows up in multiple stories. So again, when we look at this slide, it says a symbol is something that stands for something else. We talked about that yesterday. An archetype is a recurring symbol, meaning it happens again and again. It could be a character, it could be a theme, it could be a setting, something that is in multiple stories, multiple genres. So there are some different types of archetype. For example, situational. So when you think about a story, this would be something that happens over and over and over in multiple different stories. Here's a good example of, in all Cinderella stories, right, you've got the girl who's an orphan, is mistreated, and then it's saved by the fairy godmother at the end, right? So that is the archetype, the Cinderella archetype, right? And it's not always a Cinderella fairy tale, but it could be a modern day story where there is an orphaned girl who's mistreated and then is saved by somebody at the end. You would say, oh, that's the Cinderella archetype. Or it could be symbolic, right? These would be symbols that occur again and again in different versions. For example, in all creation stories, whatever culture you look at, there would be a void or water, and that is what exists first. So you could say that, oh, that's the creation archetype. That whatever your culture is, it goes through there. Then we have character. Right? You could have a type of character. This is probably the most common and the easiest to recognize that occurs again and again and again. One of the most popular archetypes is the hero archetype. In many stories, there is a hero figure, right? And so you could say, oh, that is the perfect archetype of a hero. Maybe not a superhero, but a character who comes to the rescue, who saves other people. There are multiple other archetypes or typical characters. So when you think about the movies you've seen, the shows you've watched, the books you've read, there may be somebody in there who is the hero, right? That's the archetype. So make sure you put the hero archetype in there. There may be the mad scientist, right? In a lot of stories, a lot of fantasies, the bad guy, right, might be the mad scientist. There could also be a damsel in distress, or somebody who needs help, so kind of the innocent who's being saved. Then there's usually, somebody who's reluctant to come to the rescue. So these are all examples of archetypes, or the typical character. So you can think of multiple stories and say, oh yeah, that was the hero in that one. That was the person in distress. That was the sidekick. So when you think about archetype, right, there are all these different types of characters that can show up. The orphan, the child, the warrior, the rebel, right? That's a good one that pops up in a lot. And so when you think about it, all right, this character is the typical blank. That would be the archetype. Now, our other term today kind of goes along with that. If you overuse an archetype too much, or a word or a phrase, that it loses its meaning, then it becomes cliche, right? So somebody says, oh, that's so cliche, would be a phrase or opinion that is overused and loses its meaning. Most of the time, cliche is with sayings or phrases, but it can also show up in movies. Like, I've seen some of you in your responses talk about the famous Hallmark movies, right? And you could be like, oh, those are so cliche. The same thing happens in all of them. Or some different genres that are out there, that they have predictable endings. They've become cliche, and that it's used so often that that loses its thought or meaning. Some examples of phrase cliches that we use in our writing or our speaking. Oh, and they lived happily ever after. Yep, that's pretty cliche. Oh, it was a diamond in the rough. That's pretty cliche to explain somebody who rose from nothing to there. Or when somebody says something like, don't judge a book by its cover. Well, that's been used so often, and it's still a good phrase, but kind of loses its meaning because it's been done again and again and again and again. So both cliche and archetype are kind of connected to symbolism, whereas the archetype is going to be kind of a pattern or the idea which things are modeled after, the typical type of character, the typical storyline. Cliche would happen if it's overdone so much that it loses its meaning and you're just like, oh, that's out there. So as you are reading, as you are watching, as you are thinking about all of your stories, right? Think about the different archetypes that are out there, like the typical villain, the typical hero, the typical child, the orphan, the caregiver. And then also think about, are sometimes things cliche, right? Is that done so often you knew it was going to happen and it loses its meaning? So as you read your fantasy, I want to have these things in your mind. These are getting higher level, so it's a little bit more intense than just what is happening in your book. Think about the theme. What's the message? What is the author trying to show us? Think about symbols, different characters or events or things that could represent something else. And then also think about the archetype and the cliche. Are there some archetypes, either with the characters, the setting, the story, the conflict? And is anything cliche, is it overused in there? So we want you to write about those as you continue your work. So great job with our literary terms. We want to keep applying these higher level terms to show that our reading is continuing to improve.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the best reader of them all? As you continue your work this week, think about those literary terms. Keep reading, keep reflecting about your reading, keep thinking about these terms in everything you do, even when you're watching Netflix or Disney Plus. Think about those themes, symbols, archetypes, cliches. You should apply this to more than just your reading, but to